sing a little bit about Jim Bridger. Oh, Gabe, Jim Bridger, the mountain man. He trapped beaver, was an army scout, a wilderness guide, a pathfinder across the land. Oh, Jim Bridger, the mountain man. Jim Bridger, he was known for the love of telling tall tales, yet his actual life sometimes made those tall tales fade. He built Fort Bridger right where the immigrant trails converge, came through, proving he was a trapper, a scout, a pathfinder, and a hell of a businessman too. Now I'm going to stop here. I might as well go. I'm going to turn you on to my friend Josh. When it comes to Bridger, he knows a hell of a lot more than I know. Oh, Jim Bridger, the mountain man. Oh, Jim Bridger, the mountain man. Some of you, this is Alligator, of course. Some of you who are not history buffs, you probably have never heard the name Joe Bridger. If you've ever heard Kit Carson or Jim Beckworth or any of those mountain men, Joe Meek. I've, of course, been a history buff, so I've known about those guys since I was a little boy. But anyway, I was passing through Wyoming, and as always, I stopped in at Fort Bridger. And this time when I stopped in, I got Josh to, I almost said sit down with me, but we stood up and do a little show with me. I hope you will enjoy it. Even if you don't know about Jim Bridger, stick around, listen to this story, especially how he escaped when the army came to arrest him. Ingenious. Now, before we move on, remember that every second Saturday of the month, if you're in Monterey, I will be at Bonton Elroy's Lighthouse Smokehouse, 794 Lighthouse Avenue in Monterey. I'm getting a little woozy here. I'm there every second Saturday of the month, so anytime you come into Monterey, drop in. Those of you up in Portland, look in your local paper. You might find me there over the end of this month. I'm not going to say anything more. I'm just hoping that this thing opens up, and I am going to the Pacific Northwest. So that's about it. Also, Friday Night Designs. You know, I keep talking about them. Friday Night Designs for all of your media needs. I've been talking about them for so long, and I was going to get on board with them. And just as we had both came to the thing to actually do it, my friend who owns the place had a medical emergency. He called me. So anyway, we're going to have to wait just a little bit more. But please go check out their website. And is there anything else I can think of? Anyway, there we go. Jim Bridger. Before we get started on whatever we're doing, I'd like to remind you that please hit the like button and the subscription button. It doesn't cost you anything. It only takes a minute, and it helps me greatly. Okay, so if you could do that, I would appreciate it. Thank you so much. Okay, this is Alligator in Alignment. I'm here at Jim Bridger Historic Fort. I've been here a few times before. Me and my wife, whenever we come through Arizona, we always like to come here. And many of you know me. You know I'm a history buff. Like I'm a big fan of Jim Bridger, Jim Beckworth, Kit Carson and Coulter and all of those guys. But I'm very fortunate to have my friend Josh here today. He's the curator for the entire thing. And we're just going to let Josh tell us something about Fort Bridger.
So yeah, Fort Bridger, of course, is right along a natural corridor through the Rocky Mountains, which is part of what's made it such an important historic site. And of course, if we go back to the very earliest evidence we have of people being in this area, we actually have to go back 13,000 years ago. So
the Shoshones, I think, were here. I think.
Yeah.
I don't know what tribe it was.
Of course, very early on, there archaeologists found what is known as a bison antiquus, or the remains of one, anyways, I should say. And as they were excavating that, they found stone spear points and stone scrapers, and along the bones you could see where someone had cut the meat off those bones, and those bones date back to 13,000 years ago. So that's the earliest evidence we have of people. I personally suspect it probably goes much further back than that, but based on the evidence, we can say at least that far.
They came through this area when they were going to hunt buffalo out on the plains. This was like a spot.
And it's the easiest way over the Rocky Mountains, and of course I-80 follows this same route today because, again, it is the easiest way over the Rocky Mountains. So, being that, everything that's come west seems to have needed to pass through Fort Bridger because of that natural corridor. So, of course, just on this other side off camera where folks can't see is where we have the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Mormon Trail, the Pony Express, the Overland Stagecoach, the Cherokee, and actually several other trails that cross right through our site here.
We're right in the vortex of a whole bunch of history.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And because all those people need to come through here, we have just an incredible amount of history here. And, of course, if we go back to the earliest historical records, we know in 1824 a group of mountain men, including a very young teenage Jim Bridger, came through this area. And, of course, it was just after that they continued moving west from here, and they found the Bear River. And two of the older fur trappers in the area, they got into a debate on whether the Bear River would outlet in the Pacific Ocean or in a lake. And of course, as they got more and more heated in that debate, money got thrown down on that debate, and it turned into a bet. And young Jim Bridger was asked to follow the river down, and was offered part of the reward from the winnings of that if he would do so. So he agreed to do that. They built a bull boat, and he floated down the Bear River. And of course, at the end of the Bear River, he got into a wide section of water, a large body of it, and he stuck his hand down in and tasted it, and came back and reported that it definitely outlet in the Pacific Ocean. Of course, because that salty water he tasted made him believe that, and of course we know that actually is the Great Salt Lake. So, needless to say, the wrong guy won the money on that one, but that's how it is in gambling, I suppose.
Oh yes.
Yeah, so of course, as you can see, there's a huge amount of vegetation, grass here. We don't actually water anything here. This is all natural growth. And of course, based on the historical descriptions, we know that two of the biggest things that people moving across this area mentioned was the good fishing and the good grazing for their animals. So this is essentially the descendants of the plants that would have been here during Jim Bridger's time. And it grows pretty much all summer long on its own, making this kind of an oasis in the Wyoming desert, which makes it another excellent reason to have a spot here. And of course, that being said, that means there's water here, which means even to this day we still have to fight beavers every once in a while if we want to dam up the creek and flood our historic structures. So there's been quite a few years where I wake up every morning, come and pull down the beaver dam so that my buildings don't get flooded out, and eventually they get the idea and move off to another place, which is good. But yeah, so of course the fur trappers were here for all through the fur trade, catching beaver here. Now, of course, by 1840, they had the last rendezvous, just due to declining fur prices. At their highest, they had been over $7 a pound for beaver fur, and by the 1840s, they were getting down to like 26 cents a pound for beaver fur.
For those of you out there who just heard the word rendezvous and you don't know what that is, at a certain time of the year, he would know more about it. All of the trappers came down and they got together, and it was just a big party. They had horse races and wrestling and just shooting contest,
contest.
and it was just incredible. And one of the things about Kit Carson, which Kit Carson was a little guy. I mean, a really little guy. Like 5'5" or 5'6" or something. But he had the reputation of being able to out wrestle, outrun, outdo any of the mountain men. He became a legend for that. But that's what the rendezvous is for those of you who heard the name and doesn't know it. It was a time when they all got together. They had a big celebration.
It was basically payday. They got one payday a year, and that was when they turned their furs in and got a resupply for the year. So it was usually quite a party and celebration.
And a lot of booze.
A lot of alcohol. Yeah.
Yeah. And continue, my
But
friend.
yeah. So of course, with the collapse of the fur trade, Jim Bridger and most of the other mountain men found themselves out of a job.
Yeah.
There just wasn't any money in the beaver anymore. And Jim Bridger actually went back to Missouri, back to city life for about 3 months, and decided that was all he could stand of city life. So, much like myself, I didn't last very long in the city, and he decided he needed to get back out to the mountains. So, he decided to partner with a man by the name of Louis Vasquez, who was his partner, and they came up here and they established a trading post. And the original intent of that trading post was to do trade with the Native Americans here. And of course, being a natural pass, this was already a huge trade network in this area with the Native Americans. So a lot of people kind of think of Fort Bridger as being built out in the middle of nowhere, and that's not quite true. If you're going to build a store, you probably want to build it in the strip mall, right, where there's other stores and there's already a market
Location.
And that's exactly what Jim Bridger did. He knew there was huge Native American trade here, and he thought, well, there's my market. Let's go build a fort there. So of course, they were making these plans in 1840, and they completed the trading post here in 1843. Now, by that point, they'd been surprised by something that had started to happen. A large movement of people looking to move west. Of course, the Oregon Trail, the California Trail were just in their beginning stages at that point. And of course, as all things moving west must, they had to come through Fort Bridger. So Fort Bridger became an excellent stopping place for supplies, and Jim Bridger and Louis Vasquez were able to make a huge amount of money here. In fact, one of my favorite stories about the money making here is one of their biggest selling points was livestock, so oxen, mules, horses. They would bring out huge amounts of those animals every spring, get them established here. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the grass is fantastic here. And so of course, as people were traveling, if you're going along the Oregon Trail or the California Trail, this is the halfway mark. And even if you are just a Utah pioneer headed to, Utah, you're 110 miles away from Salt Lake, but you've just crossed Wyoming, the hardest part of the trail system. So of course, by the time you get here, your animals are kind of shot, they're tired, they're worn out. This was a great place to take a little bit of a refresher. And of course, Jim Bridger was more than happy to come out and say, hey, that pair of oxen you have looks like it's pretty worn out. Tell you what, I've got this fresh pair of oxen ready to go. Trade your old oxen in, and we'll cut some of the price off of that, and we'll send you with a fresh pair of oxen. And of course, his job at that point was then to take that old pair of oxen that's worn out, and because the grass grows naturally here and there's so much water here, he just had to let them go graze themselves back to happy.
Back to health.
Only job he had there was driving them into the corral area so that the wolves and bears wouldn't get them in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And then open the gate in the morning so they could go eat themselves back to happiness. And of course, 3 weeks later, hey, that group of oxen you got's looking pretty hammered. I've got this fresh pair ready to go that is now healthy again.
Same line.
Yep, just turning over those animals, kind of a used livestock salesman, you could call them. But they made a huge amount of money off of that, as well as the supplies they were selling. Also, a blacksmith shop here for any of the repairs you need to make on your wagon. So this really did have everything you needed.
This was like the mall.
Yeah, absolutely. and one of the things that also kind of gets forgotten about this is a lot of people neglect the Shoshone presence here specifically, which is a shame because Jim Bridger and Lou Vasquez were certainly selling as much as they could here.
They knew.
But every description we have of immigrants coming through Fort Bridger always describe a plethora, is usually how it's worded, of Indian lodges or teepees,
Yeah,
wickiups,
yeah.
standard housing for the Shoshone. And we know sometimes those numbers were up to 120, possibly even more at times. Shoshone that were camped out here. This was one of their favorite summer campsites. And you better believe they were bringing their stuff here. They were also making profit off of this area, and they were selling their goods right alongside Jim Bridger and Louis Vasquez. So it wasn't so much an individual trading post as it would be described better as a marketplace.
As a marketplace,
So,
And when did the intersection between Jim Bridger and the Mormons?
so that would have first occurred in 1847. So, of course, 1847 was the year that the Mormon pioneers first started moving west,
Yeah,
led by Brigham Young.
Brigham Young.
Yeah, and of course, Brigham Young, as he was making his way west, as he stopped here, he realized just how important this area was going to be to his people moving this way.
Yeah.
So, of course, as they were moving closer and closer, Bridger and Brigham Young, they didn't talk here at Fort Bridger. He actually run into Jim Bridger further east along the trail. But after getting here and seeing this, he talked to Louis Vasquez, and he was actually interested in purchasing it. He hadn't even made it to the Salt Lake Valley yet, but he knew how important this spot was going to be. So he actually offered to purchase it then and there. Of course, Bridger and Vasquez were making quite a bit of money and told them no. But being the persistent fellow that Brigham Young was, he kept at it, and year after year he made more and more offers. In 1853, 54, sometime in there he offered $8,000 for the purchase of the fort.
Now, I must interject. Those of you who don't know, let me tell you, $8,000 back then, you were a millionaire.
A good chunk of money for sure.
Yes.
And so Bridger and Vasquez had said, that's a pretty good price. So they started negotiations, and by 1855, Louis Vasquez actually made his way down to Salt Lake to kind of finalize the purchase of that and finish up the paperwork. Of course, he was going down there to represent both himself and as a representative for Jim Bridger. Yeah. So he was signing the documents for both himself and for Jim Bridger as Jim Bridger's representative. And of course, part of the reason he had that job is he was literate and could read and write, whereas Jim Bridger was not.
Yeah.
So he was a good representative there. Now, as they moved forward with that, Louis Vasquez got down there. They agreed to purchase the fort in 2 payments of $4,000. So basically, that was going to be in gold. And that was a lot of gold. So he only wanted 4,000 of it at a time. So he loaded the first $4,000 in his wagon and then started heading back. Now, unfortunately for Jim Bridger, he had a lot of other things going on at that time. Jim Bridger was here, and as he was watching the trading post, he didn't realize there was actually a warrant out for his arrest, because a change had happened that he probably wasn't even entirely aware of in 1850 when the Utah Territory was organized. This part of Wyoming was actually part of that original Utah Territory, which meant that Jim Bridger found himself living under U.S. law for the first time in his life since he was a teenager.
A mountain man living under law?
Yeah, pretty hard transition for him.
Yes.
And of course, U.S. law at the time forbade the sale of alcohol or ammunition to Native Americans. And of course, he was doing a lot of selling of both of those items to his Native American friends up here. So of course, largely due to actually other bad things that were going on at the Green River just east of here, where there'd been some illegal ferries set up, and people weren't paying their taxes, and there was quite a bit of trouble over there. A 150-man posse was sent to go clean up everything going on over at Green River, and as kind of a side task, they were said, hey, while you're up in that area, go ahead and arrest Jim Bridger and bring him back to Salt Lake for trial. Now, I do not believe that Jim Bridger even knew there was a warrant out for his arrest. And so it's very easy to see from Jim Bridger's perspective, where he sees 150 guys with rifles coming, and that made him pretty nervous, as I would imagine it would make just about anybody.
Skedaddle.
And he said, this ain't my first rodeo. So if we know he made a run for it, he ran to the southeast of here until he found a tree with an eagle's nest in it, climbed up in the eagle's nest, and he hid in that eagle's nest for 3 days while the Mormon posse looked around for him.
They would never think of looking up in the eagle's nest.
Especially not. I think even if you were looking for a teenager, you might think to look up, but Jim Bridger was into his early 50s by this point.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
especially if you're looking for a guy
Yeah.
in his 50s,
No.
you'd never think to look
Yeah.
up a tree. So, yeah, very smart move on Jim Bridger's part. And of course, he hung out there for 3 days while his Shoshone wife was able to smuggle out his $20 worth of gold, enough food and supplies, and eventually 2 horses to him. And as soon as he got those, he rode straight for Washington, D.C. And of course, upon arriving at Washington, D.C., he gave his perspective on the story, which was a Mormon army came and stole my fort. Now, part of that Mormon posse's job, as they came to arrest Jim Bridger, they were also ordered to seize and destroy the alcohol that was here. And I find that one to be a particularly funny story because the guy who was in charge of that posse, he did write back that he had seized the alcohol, him and his men, and they had destroyed it in doses. So we know what happened to that alcohol pretty well. And of course, the next morning after seizing that alcohol, they weren't in too great a shape. So that probably didn't help with the hunt for Jim Bridger, with everybody stumbling around as much as they were. So I'm sure that certainly didn't help their search. But needless to say, as he was in Washington, D.C. giving his report, his partner, Louis Vasquez, had actually already received the first $4,000 worth of gold and had made it back to here and seen kind of what was going on here at Fort Bridger, and he decided to keep moving right along with that gold because, it was 50% his fort, and if there was an arrest warrant out for Jim Bridger, he thought, well, maybe I'm next, maybe I'm on that list too, so he kept moving and kind of got out of Dodge for a while. And because of that, Jim Bridger and Louis Vasquez weren't able to communicate, and in 1858, he did pick up the second payment of $4,000, so he did get fully paid for that. But that doesn't mean Jim Bridger knew that they got fully paid for that. And Jim Bridger, until the end of his days, claimed that the fort was stolen,
They were stolen
by the Mormons, so there was always some bad blood there after that, which kind of makes perfect sense as you go forward with the history because, all of that built up tension between not just Jim Bridger and the Mormons, but really the U.S. government and the Mormons was really coming to a point. By 1857, we have what became known as the Utah War starting, where again President Buchanan, back in Washington, D.C., was kind of hearing word that the Mormons were getting ready to invade not only Washington, D.C., but then from there take over the rest of the nation. And those rumors were spreading, and he decided to go with those as his gut thought. And of course, Jim Bridger's testimonial that his fort had been stolen by a Mormon army certainly did not help that particular worry. Now, on the same note, the people in Utah were also getting word, especially since they'd moved out here after things like the Missouri Extermination Order, where it became legal in the state of Missouri to kill someone if they were Mormon. So they were still pretty worried about that kind of thing. So when they heard the U.S. government was getting ready to come out here, they started to believe the rumors that these guys were coming out to kill every man, woman, and child, which was also not true. So we have both sides getting these rumors, tensions go up, and you can imagine that escalated pretty quickly from there. So President Buchanan, deciding he needed to take action, mobilized 1/3 of the United States military and sent them out to go take care of that Mormon army.
They didn't do very well.
No, they did not. As they were getting closer and closer, of course, the Mormons who were stationed here at Fort Bridger, because at that point, this became the Eastern Front. This is where that first conflict was supposed to happen. So they started building defenses as quickly as they could. In about 18 months, they built a 15-foot tall cobblestone wall around the original wood stockade fortress that Jim Bridger had built. So they really amped up the defenses here. And of course, upon completing that project, they had a great celebration. Hey, we finished this wall, we've got a chance here. A week later, the Mormon scouts came in and said, you should see the artillery these guys are bringing. If we stay here, they're going to surround our fort, they're going to bombard us. We're not even going to be close enough to shoot back with our rifles. We're just going to get bombarded until we die. They realized we have no chance of winning this fight. The military has us outnumbered and outgunned. And so they made new plans real fast. They brought in their wagons, they loaded their wagons up to maximum capacity with everything they could. Anything they couldn't fit in the wagons that they could, they buried, and they actually stomped livestock over top of that to make it look like it was a corral area, planning to come back for that. And then anything they couldn't bury or load in their wagons, they burned.
They burned. Yeah.
So they lit Fort Bridger on fire, burnt it to the ground, everything except those cobblestone walls, which, as you can imagine, didn't burn real well. And then that's actually not even where they stopped. They burnt all the area around they could, all the trees, all the grass, and then the Oregon Trail, which was 60 miles of territory that they burned, a half mile on either side of the trail, just as a desperate attempt to try and slow the military. They were certainly scared, and they certainly knew they were outgunned and outnumbered. So they were in a bit of a panic. Now, of course, that ended up, I think, being probably one of the best decisions of the entire conflict. And I say that because it really stopped a larger conflict from breaking out. Because, of course, as the military hit that last 60 miles of trail before Fort Bridger, they ended up in a bad way. Their mules, their horses, their oxen suddenly had nothing to eat. And, of course, they had plans of getting to Salt Lake earlier in the fall of 1857. By November, they just arrived here at Fort Bridger, and of course they also met the early Wyoming snow.
Yes, that's what I was going to say.
Yep.
Yes.
So of course they ended up spending a very miserable winter here. They ended up having to kill all the horses that weren't already dead, all the animals. And they amazingly didn't have any of their men starve to death or freeze to death. They did a pretty good job keeping everybody alive, but it was kind of a just barely type of a situation.
Oh yeah, that must have been horrendous.
Yeah. So of course, what also happened though during that winter was some of those who had hotter heads were kind of stuck and had to simmer in it, and some of those who had cooler heads actually were allowed to take action. So some of the subordinate officers convinced Albert Sidney Johnston, who was leading that expedition, to send envoys down to Salt Lake. And after communications, which were very tenuous, they ended up more or less coming to the point where they were talking to each other, and they realized, oh, you guys aren't getting ready to invade the United States? Oh, you aren't here to kill us all?
Yeah.
Do we actually have a reason to fight?
Yeah.
And it was decided more or less no. There's, of course, a lot of other details in that, but that's the long and short of the story. And so part of that agreement, though, was that Fort Bridger was officially turned over into military hands. So the military was here from 1857 until 1890. And of course their job at that point was investing in the westward moving trail system.
Yes.
Of course the U.S. government had huge ambitions for people settling in the West and expanding the American nation that they started. And so of course they had huge interest in putting forts along that trail system, because the safer they could make that trail system for immigrants moving out, the more people would feel comfortable moving out. So that was probably the biggest reason they wanted the military fort here. Of course, some of the other reasons they had it here were, also to keep an eye on the Mormons. They weren't 100% convinced that they weren't dangerous. So this was a good, close position to keep an eye on the Mormons. And this was also a really good tactical point for the Indian Wars. So of course, they were fighting the Utes down in the south in Colorado and Utah, and they were also mobilized in to go fight some of the tribes in the northern areas. So even though there weren't any battles fought here at Fort Bridger, this was a huge tactical location to move troops.
Through, and everything like
and
that.
So it became hugely important for that. And of course, by the 1890, Wyoming officially became a state of the Union, and by that point, of course, the trail system, which had largely they'd stopped using that in 1869 when the railroad was completed, because the railroad was just much more efficient. So that wasn't really a concern of theirs anymore. The Indian Wars had all been resolved by that point, and treaties had been signed and signed. And then, of course, it'd been years since the Mormons had shown any sign of rebellion, so they also weren't worried about that one either. So they realized there just wasn't the need for the military presence here anymore. So they disbanded the fort in 1890, and of course, from there, it spent a couple decades as more or less a dairy farm. In fact, the old military barracks that houses our museum today housed a lot more cattle than it ever did soldiers. And then, of course, in my personal opinion, the most important event to ever happen here at Fort Bridger happened in 1933. That is when Fort Bridger was opened up as Wyoming's first historic site, along with a museum here. And of course, that's why we're here today
That's-
and why we get to
isn't it-
share this history today.
Isn't that wonderful? You know, one of the things when you mentioned Jim and his Shoshone wife, contrary to the way Hollywood portrays things, the mountain men, even though they were sometimes adversaries with the natives, they all had respect for the native people.
In fact, I would even take it so far as to say the biggest compliment you could have given Jim Bridger would have been to mistake him for an Indian brave.
Yes.
There would have been no higher compliment you could have given Jim Bridger than making that mistake.
I did a podcast recently with a friend of mine who was great-great-grandfather fought in the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson. And my tribe, the Choctaws and the Cherokees, he told him, he says, listen, I can't save New Orleans without your help. Come help me drive the British out. And he signed a treaty and did all this stuff like they used to do. Said, if you help me, your land will be yours as long as the sun rises and sets. And as soon as he became president, he says, oh, I want the land. He took all of that land and marched his way out to Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And Davy Crockett was a friend of Andrew Jackson. They were both sort of folk heroes at that time. And David Crockett, he fought in the Creek War, but he was always an advocate for the natives. He says, the United States is not treating these people correct. And when he heard Andrew Jackson had turned his back on the tribes after his promises, they were both politicians, and he went and they became enemies. Finally, because Andrew Jackson was president, he destroyed David Crockett's political career.
Mm-hmm.
And the last words with David Crockett was, because he thought they were all hypocrites, and the last words he said, you guys can all go to hell. I'm going to Texas. And he went to the Alamo, and we know
what happened there.
Listen, this is wonderful, my friend. You know what I mean? I love this stuff. This is Alligator in Alignment. My friend Josh, we when I come through here again, I'm going to pick certain little things to do. On my way out, I'm going to do a Instagram post about this punishment horse that they have. That is incredible.
It really is.
So, this is Alligator in Alignment saying happy trails.